My name is Danny Harris, and I'm talking with some echo. But I'm very proud and honored to be the Executive Director of Transportation Alternatives and to join a really inspiring group of people today talking about open streets. Transportation Alternatives is New York City's leading walking, biking, and public transportation advocacy organization. We've been around for about 47 years and have helped to pilot a number of big ideas for the city, from protected bike lanes to now open streets and everything in between. And I'm incredibly proud to stand with a really great panel today of partners for TA and also in the open streets movement. So what I'd like to do is briefly introduce them and then start in a conversation and really welcome your ideas and feedback as well. There's a chat function where you can feel free to add comments or ideas along the way, and then we'll open it up to questions afterwards. But let me start by introducing Meera Joshi. Meera is a principal and GM at Sam Schwartz, which is a leading engineering, planning, and consulting firm here in New York, but doing work all over. Before she was with Sam Schwartz, Meera was the CEO and chair of the New York City Taxi and Limousine Commission and served as a visiting scholar at the NYC Rudin Center for Transportation Policy. So welcome, Meera.
Thank you.
We have Mike Lydon, who is a principal at Street Plan Collaborative, an urban planning design and advocacy firm. He's really been one of the godfathers of tactical urbanism, and you've probably seen his work or his writing, and he's also been collecting really what's happening across the world in terms of open streets and also, I believe, what he calls coded streets. Shahbaz Stewart is the founder and CEO of Oonee, which is a company that's trying to bring secure bike parking to New York. He's a lifelong resident of Brooklyn. He's also on TA's advisory council and a passionate advocate for the city, as are other members. So I know that when we started this conversation around open streets and putting this panel forward, the world was a very different place. And I guess I just wanted to start by getting a perspective from each of the panelists. What role you see open streets playing today, obviously amid COVID and the aftermath of George Floyd. How has the conversation in your work changed around open streets today? Meera, can I start with you, and then would welcome Mike and Shahbaz's perspective as well?
Sure, and I think I get the advantage if I start first, because many of these topics are prevalent today and there's lots of discussion, so it's very difficult to be unique in your perspective. So I'll give, my thoughts about it are, I think the first thing that stands out is, especially around George Floyd, we're at an age where so much of discourse about social change is on the internet, but this was, an extreme and vivid and rightful example of the fact that real social change comes from public space and people's ability to gather in public space and come together in unity in a mission. And so prior to that, COVID, had us thinking about open space and for health reasons and for distance and to get exercise. And then all of a sudden it elevated to much more than that, but a reason and the only way to really have a platform that everyone can access for social change. So the importance of open streets, access to public space, space for people and not cars, has become even more vital to not just our health as a community, but our equity and advancement as a community.
Thanks, Meera. I'll chime in. I think my perspective or my definition of open streets was pretty fixed for a long time. I became very enamored with open streets, like many, I'm sure, on this webinar today, with what I learned about more than 15 years ago. And it must have been Clarence's first street film covering what happened in Bogota, along with the Streets Blog crew, and helping to bring that idea to Miami back in 2008. And then, we helped start this movement in the U.S. with the Open Streets Project, and define best practices, and really kind of been pushing on open streets as a program that cities could adopt and partner with nonprofit organizations to ideally scale up to be a very frequent occurrence. But open streets being defined as completely car-free, kind of event-driven, supportive programming etc. And all of that sense of open streets has morphed in the last, let's say, 3 months, but particularly in the last 3 weeks. And there's a use of the term that expands the definition. And I've been kind of wrestling with that a little bit about how do we think about open streets like summer streets now in the context of COVID and George Floyd and all the things that have come up. And I think really sitting with that for a few weeks has gotten me to the point where I'm really thinking about that expansiveness is a good thing, that if we can be inclusive in the term, that it can be, dining streets, and it can be some of the slow streets, which I would define what's happening in New York City as what we're seeing with the Open Streets program here. It really is more like slow streets in other cities, but we can maybe use that umbrella term if you like. For protests, that open streets really need to be fundamentally open for people to express their opinions, and it's their right to do so. And so, an open street is one where we all feel comfortable, no matter our background or race or age or whatever it may be. So I've been really kind of thinking about that a lot and thinking about kind of the next steps for the whole other movement of open streets that's been moving along for quite some time. And I kind of settle on this history of this movement. And I think about it, it goes back to the 60s and early 70s when it was really environmental activists and people who were seeking environmental justice, like activists in Bogota, that brought this kind of to the attention that we could take over streets and reuse them by a much broader set of people. And, that really rose up during the oil crisis in the early 70s. So in any event, it's been a really fascinating time. I've been listening and learning a lot about how to think about this at this time. And of course, really excited about how we can better, position and lead on open streets internationally right here in New York City. Shabazz, you're on mute.
Oops, sorry about that. My perspective on open streets foremost originates from my experience growing up in Bed-Stuy and Crown Heights. Some of my most fond memories of childhood were block parties. Every summer, late July, August, early September, every block would have a block party. You'd have one in your block. You'd go over the next block, for their block party, and everyone came out. I think that some of what makes a block party appealing is fundamentally true for the entirety of the year, especially the entirety of the summer season. A place where kids can play undaunted by traffic, a place where a community can gather, a place where people can roam and meander, a place that's free from the noise of traffic and from the commerce that normally fills the street. Now, I think that when we start bringing in, this is my experience, when we start bringing in, the name of George Floyd and some of the protests over the past 3 weeks, I have to take a look at myself growing up in New York City, and those things are all still true about what's happening in the due course of protests, right? Like, fundamentally, having open streets is not about necessarily giving people a place to protest. To me, it's about allowing civics and allowing civic life to take place in a city, regardless of what that civic life is. So everything from a green market to a protest is what we can expect in a functional civic society and democracy. And so open streets are really about giving a city a place to breathe and giving a community a place to be a community, regardless of what time of year it is, and regardless of what is manifesting in a present moment. Now, I will say that with COVID-19, you had a really fundamental question, and that question was, would people be able to capture the essence of summer, the essence of spring, the essence of early fall, with all of these restrictions in place, and would they be able to do so safely? And what we can see from what's transpired around the city, the reaction from the public has been, we're going to go outside anyway, and whether you say it's okay or not, right? And so what I see now for open streets is another dynamic where we have to consider public safety. If we are going to be asking people to socially distance, we've all seen the images of St. Mark's, which is almost by default an open street, but not really. We have to give people the space to do so. And also we have to give people the street furniture and the programming to do so as well. we've seen in Domino Park, which is of course not a street, but we've seen the value of street design and of actual, of some good solid design in terms of giving people some encouragement on what social distancing looks like. And I think that is perhaps the next frontier in our open streets conversation here in the city.
Thanks. So, I mean, a lot of this also stems on, you know, the streets looking the way that they do now. So Mira, I just saw, I think recently the governor has at least announced his plan for the second phase of reopening. You know, I'm curious from your perspective, do open streets still have a future in New York, especially as we get to phase 2?
To echo what Shabazz just said, events overtake, right? So there is a real sense of needing clarity in the city about what does phase 2 mean for streets? What does it mean for curbside parking? What does it mean for restaurants? And without that clarity, people will start doing what they feel they need to do to express themselves, to continue their businesses. And how does that reflect on the future of open streets? What it does, I think, is show us that to make more space for community doesn't have to be a large undertaking. And in fact, when we make it into a large undertaking, we paralyze ourselves in order to expand it and to grow it. And so people are doing, you know, their informal version of opening up public space with or without the city and the state's authorization. What it tells me, or what I hope it brings for the future of more public space in the way of open streets, is that we start thinking about these things less as massive events and more about normal occurrences. So paint and visuals are an amazing way to direct people to where there is a place that they can gather. Especially for the young and the old. I know personally in Brooklyn, I look around sometimes and I see some old police barricades. It takes me a few minutes to realize, oh, this is an open street, right? Like, I don't know if it's a construction zone but a little bit of paint goes a long way. It also teaches us that we can handle this as a community, you know, not always, but for the most part, because I have to even say in the last, like, if you look at since May 28th, to today, we've had thousands of people in streets every day that are normally not in streets. And who would have thought that that was, you know, something that we would say is an everyday occurrence in New York, but it is. And it's not without hiccups, but the vast majority of it is happening, and it's happening regardless. So these are, I think the idea that making a street open being such a huge event and needing so much funding and needing so much pre-planning has kind of been diluted. And the essence of let it come from the community, let it happen, and if it needs to change, it'll change, but let's not wait another day while we ponder on what the best and perfect way for it to happen. And I think that's an incredible step forward. I hope that momentum stays, because that is the way people get access the quickest, and also, quite frankly, the most cost efficient too.
I appreciate that. And Mike, I think that leads well into your work, both in terms of the collection of open streets and COVID streets that you're seeing around the world, but also the work that you're doing on the ground. So can you talk a little bit about some of the, you know, we're obviously hearing a lot of pushback and concern from cities about what they are or not able to do, or whether they're Paris or Oakland or not. But can you just talk about some of the kind of quick materials and quick builds that you're seeing being rolled out across the world that, you know, are trying to get these extended miles with, you know, limited and cheap resources that they have? Who's doing it well, and what are the ways that they're doing it?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, there's a huge variety of what cities have been able to achieve in the last 3 months. And there's, you know, a variety of mechanisms that have been employed. And there's also been a lot of very common limitations for cities. Particularly, there's been a large groundswell coming out of neighborhoods, out of advocates, you know, mouths to do this work. And, you know, I empathize with a lot of city officials who are limited in their capacity on managing streets from the comfort, or something called the comfort, but from their own homes, right? That's a challenging, tricky thing. A lot of cities have struggled with being able to access the actual raw materials, even cones. You think that any city USA must have 1,000 cones just laying around. Most don't. They rely on contractors and they rely on suppliers to be able to produce those materials. And a lot of cities got caught flat-footed in this weird, awkward space between wanting to do this kind of work, seeing the need for it and the demand for it, but not having the materials or the staff to implement. So I wanted to kind of recognize that that issue or that challenge that DOTs and public works have had around the country. That being said, we've seen a lot of success, I think, in the communities and the cities where there was already an inherent level of trust built in a collaborative way between nonprofit organizations and community groups and city electeds and leadership. And I think we really struggled in New York with that for the first 6 or 8 weeks here. That trust between mayor and staff on down to advocates was not really there, in the sense that no one was tasking a lot of us who are able-bodied and healthy, who are willing to go out into the street a couple times a day and monitor these open streets and put the barricades in. That conversation wasn't happening because there was either not enough communication that was occurring, or there wasn't that trust there. In other communities, that has not been the case. It's very much been a two-way conversation. It's been a collaboration. It's been the cities relying on neighborhood groups and residents to monitor and to put these things in and out of the street as needed. And when you think about it, it's just not that technical. And so it really does get back to Mira's point that we're seeing how easy this can be and how low key it can be if we just open up those lines of communication and trust. Globally, I think we've seen a lot more commitment to moving some of these initiatives forward in a more permanent way in European context, as well as in South America. A number of Open Streets programs are either already well established, or those types of cities had much stronger, more top-down frameworks for policies and implementation that relate to climate change, that are, resilience, to mobility. And it was interesting because a lot of cities in Europe kind of sat back for 3, 4, 5 weeks, while the US was really charging ahead with these really, really kind of homespun traffic control type interventions to make changes on streets. But we're still kind of in that material, using that materiality right now, where it looks kind of construction zony on our streets, whereas Europe kind of held back, and now they're moving forward with things that are much more interim in nature, still flexible and can be changed, but they kind of took a breath, got the resources in place. And that's Milan, that's Paris, that's Rome, that's Barcelona, London, the list goes on and on. And we're not committing to that politically in the US right now. We're not saying, you know what, here in New York City, we're gonna have 80 of these 100 miles made seasonal, or it's gonna be every weekend we're gonna do this, or there's just no commitment or leadership on how to transition this into something that's more anticipated and expected as part of city life. And in other countries, that is absolutely happening, and that's the case. And so I'm seeing that gap still. We move fast, but we're not committing politically. And I would love to see in the US more people be able to get behind that and say, look, we're going to actually leverage this into something bigger, more impactful, and that we can sustain even when hopefully the COVID pandemic is behind us.
Shahbaz, I wanted to ask you, as both a passionate cyclist and somebody who works in the space, of whether you see there's either a conflict between advancing open streets and advancing bike lanes, or better ways to integrate them across. But how do you sort of think about the intersection of those two policies, or even two narratives of what we want to be doing to our streets?
It's a great question. I think, look, I'm going to go out and say, for the most part, Open Streets has been completely unhelpful to, at least the way it's rolled out in New York, to cycling as a mode of transportation. That's because Open Streets aren't part of a network. There's no network design that accounts for a linear transportation journey. So while I may have an open street option for 5 or 6 blocks, in Lincoln Place in Crown Heights, or for 2 or 3 blocks down Underhill in Prospect Heights, that is not part of a larger journey I will have to deviate from that route when I reach the end of the Open Streets program. If we want Open Streets to be useful as a mechanism for cycling and for transportation alternatives, we have to first decide that, you know, that's actually that's a goal of the program. I don't think Open Streets has been couched or even justified to the public as inclusive of that particular vision. But, you know, if that is what we want, then we have to think about connectivity in a network sense, and how will Open Streets be used by people who rely on bikes to get where they need to go. I don't think it is sufficient to, you know, and excuse my sort of cavalier language, but to slap down some blocks of open streets, you know, randomly and expect that cyclists will just take advantage of them if they are in fact going to an end destination. We have to think a little more, holistically about where are destinations, where are people likely to go, how will they get there from other routes, and how will Open Streets be a conduit to that form of transportation. And we also have to think about, you know, when cyclists are going down the street, how does that conflict, or how does that complicate the other mission of Open Streets, which is to provide people with a place to live and play. So we're going to have to think about having a cycling zone. Otherwise, we're going to end up like the Brooklyn Bridge, where you've got people, you know, who want to bike, and you've got people who want to meander, and the two are in a state of perpetual warfare.
Yeah, I mean, I think you really sort of hit a lot of the challenges that we've seen in New York, especially, which is, I think, you know, a lot of the response to Open Streets was really more whimsy than it was functional, or it was obviously about the need for physical distancing, but it wasn't to solve more community-based problems. And I know, as all of you who do and have a lot of history of working in and across communities, you know, I'm curious, obviously New York right now, we have 40 miles down, we have 60 to go. There's not an equitable distribution of where the Open Streets are now. You know, I'm curious from each of your perspectives of how do we advance in New York and other cities to ensure that there's more, both an equitable distribution, but we're also working with communities, especially communities of color, to understand what the needs are of Open Streets and ensure that we can have conversations that really start about, you know, where they're not just where they're needed most, but what are the actual things within an Open Street that can best serve the community. So I put that out there, and Mira, do you want to get us started?
Yeah, I'll start with one. I think that a lot of what we've seen in New York has been reactive. So there's like a groundswell of this should be done. That gets louder and louder. And then it gets to a point where it's like, okay, we'll do it. And then we're doing it in a way that's just like, we said we do that, let's get this done now, right? So there's a level of expediency, a level of low-hanging fruit, and a level of reactive approach that I think cuts against the points that you're making, like, and that, you know, have been made. Are these part of a network? Do these really, are these happening in the right neighborhoods? And I think that's because to do that extra work takes extra work, right? So you have to be committed to doing that extra work. Looking at a city and how neighborhoods link together is an important exercise. And really, you know, we have a tremendously talented DOT. So like they probably have actually done all of this. I'm sure that they look at these things because they're curious and smart people. And then the second is, you know, there's those that you hear from, there's communities that you hear from that say they need space, but be careful about who you're not hearing from, because not every community has the ability to be as organized, to be as vocal, to know who to get to. And that's really where our resources should be focused. Who are we not hearing from? Why are we not hearing from them? Are we walking through those neighborhoods and seeing what's going on? Are we meeting people in the places that they will be, which is even harder now because they're not outside at places. And so a fair amount of, understandably, there can be the low-hanging fruit, the reactive, you get some miles that way, certainly, but you need to be paying some attention to looking at the city as a whole and focusing on those neighborhoods where you're not hearing anything, because those are often the ones that are in the most need. And I think we miss a lot of opportunity, and we miss a lot of ability as a city to set standards and show how this can be done, especially in the size of the city we have, when we skip those two steps, which as I said from the beginning, they take more work and they take more commitment. But once you have that, certainly have the will. This is a city that is filled with energetic and smart people that are willing to support those efforts and just raring to go.
Yeah, I love that point, Mira. Really catalyzing our local talent. I mean, we have a supply of talent and skill and passion in the city that you don't find in most places. So great point. I wish I could just bring Warren Logan in from yesterday's webinar that I was on to speak to this point, because he was very eloquent about it. But it really does come down to communication, how you position and approach different communities and let them know that you can opt into this and who it's for and what it's for. I think there's been a lot of struggle with that. Those of us who are following DOT really closely, who follow TA really closely, who are opting into the conversation, opting our neighborhoods in to be into the program, have the privilege of doing that. And Warren's point yesterday was a couple things. One was key, that he said that it is a privilege to know how to communicate with government and go back and forth. Whether that's a time privilege or it's a knowledge privilege or an access privilege. And so a lot of communities may struggle with just that basic function of having no idea how to ask a request or be a part of all this. Second, like Mira, I don't believe that all communities around the city would not actually see the value of Open Streets if it's actually servicing their needs. And so Open Streets doesn't have to be about one thing to one group of people. It can be about many things that can happen once the streets are made available. So that could be for having shady places and cool spaces in the summer. That can be about service delivery. It can be about more play-oriented spaces, more mobility-oriented spaces. Explaining that, presenting those options, and having an open dialogue with community leaders and residents can unearth what the desire is. And what Warren said in Oakland was that a lot of folks in East Oakland pushed back on the program for a couple of reasons. One, they didn't really know what the intent was. Two, the aesthetics of it looked exactly like the BRT system that's being built right through their community right now. So they're tired of the construction, they're tired of the cones, they're tired of the disruption. And so kind of all resonated that, what is coming, what is this for? Is there something bigger that we haven't been a part of? And so a lot of people pushed back on it, understandably. And they've since gotten to the deeper, conversation and done the work that Mira just referenced, and have understood those concerns and have pivoted the program in those parts of the city to be about clear connections to the grocery store, clear connections to the bus stop, clear connections to the pharmacy, and had those conversations to position it in a way that resonates with people and what they need at this time, recognizing that COVID is impacting communities and neighborhoods very unevenly across metropolitan areas. So I'll leave it at that, but it was a great conversation yesterday, and I'm happy to bring a little bit of Warren's wisdom and the experience in Oakland into this conversation.
So I'm struggling a little bit about with where I should begin. I think as far as minority communities, and I grew up in three predominantly Black, one West Indian, the other two African American, and mixed communities here in Brooklyn. As far as my experience is concerned, growing up in New York City, everything about Open Streets from a conversation perspective has failed. And there's really no easy way to say it. Look, let's just start with the name and title of the program, Open Streets, right? I think that may have resonance with, with people in Park Slope and certain other parts of the city that are perhaps more in line with Transalt and advocacy. But if you come to Flatbush and you come to East New York and you say Open Streets, no one will know what that means. It's just not a term that makes any sense to anyone who's not in the know. And so as a result, per Mike Leiden's point, you're already starting to have a conversation that's framed in a foreign language, and you can't get buy-in speaking a different language. When you have people who don't even know what the program is, and you're relying on them to reach out to you, the result pattern is predictable. And we've seen in terms of mileage, neighborhoods that are predominantly affluent, neighborhoods that are predominantly white, have tended to dominate the Open Streets dialogue and rollout here in New York City, and neighborhoods that are not, neighborhoods that are of color, which are more than half the city, have largely been left out. So we need to start engaging communities in language they understand. I can talk about, my communities growing up. We all understood what a block party was. We all understood giving people a place to play. We all understood the idea of safety for kids and allowing kids to socialize with each other. Why aren't we going to communities? And I actually reject the notion that, at least from my perspective growing up, that communities don't have the bandwidth to organize. We've seen some of these communities, we're seeing right now with Black Lives Matters, communities can be very organized in articulating their perspective to government, but they have to want to be organized. They have to be given something that appeals to them. And so when you go to those communities and say, listen, how about we create a ongoing block party or ongoing place for programming, an ongoing place where your kids will be safe if you have to go back to work, if you are an essential worker. We're looking at shutting down, several blocks in Bed-Stuy in a linear pattern. I think that'd be very popular, I really do. And how about going to after school programs? How about going to organizations like Canvas, CBOs, that actually, have excess bandwidth right now because they can't have after school programs. There's no place to do it indoors, and saying, how about you do programming outdoors on these open streets? So now, per a block party format, you're not just having places where people can congregate, you're having programming for them as well in a place, in a linear pattern that makes sense, that people can actually locate and identify. There are a lot of strong CBOs here in Bed-Stuy. You've got the Bed-Stuy Restoration Plaza. There are lots of CBOs who would love to program these spaces. In Crown Heights and Lincoln Place, we have a fairly long open streets, but the way that it's been rolled out is indicative of the challenges, I think challenges is probably a nice way to put it, the challenges that we faced in rolling out this program. So, you see like one police barricade in the corner of Franklin and Lincoln Place, and you talk to people in the street, they say, oh, there's some construction work maybe happening here today. I mean, I don't know why that barricade's there. What does open streets mean? I don't really know. So under those circumstances, how can residents ever be expected to even take advantage of the open streets they already have if they don't know what it is, how long it's going to stay, the hours of operation, what they're supposed to do, et cetera, yet alone how are they going to advocate for new locations? I really do think the message, if it's fine-tuned to a language that people can really comprehend and take in, would really be popular, broadly speaking, across the city. But we really have to do that work proactively. We can't rely on neighborhoods to reach out to us. We really have to go and engage them on their own terms.
Mira, I'm curious from your perspective too on this, because especially with your background with the TLC, a lot of the pushback that we've been getting on open streets is from taxis, FHVs, cargo and delivery. And, I think maybe part of it is the name of open streets, part of it is the lack of communication, but can you also give a perspective of how we can reduce friction, especially for, drop off and delivery and other, vehicles that actually do have to move through these spaces?
I spent probably 7 years representing the driver's perspective. Like I drive for a living, I work, so I need to be able to get around. And the more that it's difficult to get around, the more angry my customer's going to be. They're not going to tip me. And, and so drivers tend to, have problems with bus lanes and things that make their getting around harder. But it comes down to communication, because a lot of times that what you hear for drivers, when they hear things like open streets, is like, oh, they're going to block off a main artery and I'm going to have to go around. And maybe that's not true. Maybe in the planning, it's already been thought through of what are the alternative ways, or this actually was picked because it's not blocking off a main artery. Whatever it is, it's going to be bad unless you have some communication plan to preview, or as you're rolling something out, address the driver community. And it's completely possible, because in New York City, we're one of the only cities that actually has contact information for those 150,000 men and women who drive every day in New York City. You can text message them, you can email them, you can give them information about exactly what's happening in the moment that it's happening. And you can also meet with the leaders of the driver organization groups. You could even this is crazy but true, you could even go to those groups beforehand and say, we're thinking about these, you know, like get their impact too, you know, get their input too. Now, most of them will grumble, but that's a generalization. A lot of people who spend time driving day and night for a living have a lot of really good thoughts about what works and what doesn't work. And there's nothing to be lost in gathering those kinds of perspective. And that goes back to, I think, my first point about the work. Like, there's a lot of information gathering that should go on before we make these decisions or as we're making these decisions. And we have a lot of people that know streets extremely well, especially the driving community. So yes, there's pushback. Yes, it can be overcome. And yes, communication is key. And we're very fortunate to have the ability to do that in New York City, to communicate directly with 130 to 150,000 drivers. And that's a tool that we can use.
Thanks. I want to close with this question, and then we have a lot of questions coming in, so I want to keep that space open. But I just want to get all of your perspectives on what role you think enforcement should play in open streets.
I guess I'll dive in. As little as needed. I mean, to the extent on the user population, I think the biggest concern I have with enforcement is just making sure that the streets themselves are safe for everybody who's using them, meaning that we don't have collisions happening and big differences between speeding vehicles and people who are encouraged to be in the street. You know, just a quick anecdote, it's a little bit challenging for me with a 2.5-year-old explaining to him as we walk around our neighborhood in Clinton Hill, some streets you can walk in, cross the street and be in, and other streets we have to be very cautious and careful. That doesn't really, you know, resonate. And I think for just overall, it really brings home the point to me that it can be a bit confusing on how to manage some of the streets and their closures. Obviously, the enforcement that was put into place back in April with the initial pilot for open streets in New York City failed dramatically. I don't think we have to get into the details of why that was. It was very clear it was going to fail from the outset. So it's certainly not placing police officers within every single block to manage this. But I think part of it can be about the barricades, you know, their aesthetics, how they're utilized, and then the signing and messaging that drivers get. You know, in New York, we've got these 8.5 by 11, you know, printed yellow signs that you can barely read from 10 feet away as a pedestrian, let alone as a driver, to communicate what's going on there. So I think we can use some of the design elements and the legibility of who the street's for, what it's being used for, and for how long and when, and be able to communicate that back to the broader public. And it would help with a number of the confusing, you know, looks that people have, or the incursions of vehicles maybe going faster than they should, not understanding what's going on in the street. So some of the design elements have to reinforce the intent, and let the design do most of the enforcement is really, I think, an important point to make.
Oh, sorry, you. Look, I think I want to acknowledge the 800-pound gorilla in the room. We're having a national and really a global conversation about law enforcement. So when we ask the question about what role enforcement is going to play in a program, you know, we want to be mindful of this larger conversation that we're having and how it applies, or maybe how it doesn't apply. I'm of the opinion that, you know, enforcement is always going to be a key part of traffic and traffic management. And I think we would be wrong to pretend that it's not. But we're having a conversation that largely, you know, revolves around two fundamental questions. One is, what is the role of enforcement? When is it needed? And two, what does that enforcement ultimately look like? You know, I think that as we've seen on some open streets programs, excuse me, so far, is that we actually don't need a ton of enforcement to achieve success, right? We can have the community largely police itself. We don't need to have law enforcement come and tell people they have to move. You don't need to have cops patrolling. This is actually what the mayor initially said needed to happen, but you know, that's largely been untrue. Communities can implement and police this program with very little law enforcement support. But you know, if there is a need for some sort of enforcement, what does that actually have to look like? And you know, we should not equate enforcement with problematic enforcement. A lot of the problems that we're having right now is that, you know, the enforcement as it exists today, the NYPD per se in New York City, is a very flawed, problematic organization, and they're going about enforcement in exactly the wrong way in many cases. So what would an idealized enforcement scenario look like for an open streets program? It would look like a public safety officer, unarmed, coming, you know, and informing people, hey, you know, just tomorrow we have a program. Please, if you're parked, you know, just consider what your next step is going to be. And if there's a dispute, as sometimes there is in New York City, having somebody who's trained in community policing, you know, a community intervention officer, again, doesn't have to, we're not talking about an armed policeman. We're talking about someone who is working as a public safety outreach officer in the community-based, coming and having that conversation with somebody. You know, an armed policeman whose primary training is in criminal activity and in deterring criminal activity, you know, that's largely violent in nature, is not an appropriate, you know, not an appropriate way to enforce an open streets program unless we're talking about an armed gunfight in the middle of open streets. So I wanted to unpack that question because I think that, you know, I think that given the conversation we're having, you know, it's very easy and tempting for us to say that enforcement may not play a role at all, or, you know, needs to be marginalized. But no, I think that we have to have a conversation about what kind of enforcement is needed and when is it appropriate before, you know, before we dismiss that entirely.
I think just two quick points to build on what's been said. One, I think the first thing, my first reaction with the you know, the first foray into open streets that happened, I think in end of March, early April, was the presumption of the need for the police. Because then it started out with, we're gonna open this up and the expectation is the public won't know how to handle themselves. And I thought it was a very poor expectation, like we are better than that. And so that, starting from that setup, actually, you know, it assumes that people will act out in a way that's not conducive to the program being able to continue. And I think it sends that exact same message. It's a really, you know, disheartening message to send. So I agree that, you know, there has to be enforcement, but, you know, there's things like ambassadors that can explain, which is often the problem that people are having more than anything else. What exactly is going on? At Sam Schwartz, we have our, you know, PTMs that are in the subway now explaining social distance. They're not security guards. They're not trained they don't carry any weapons, but they literally just explain. And that communication tends to diffuse a situation. And then I just think that the role of visuals, we should really not minimize that. I know growing up in West Philadelphia, we had a lot of block parties, and you always knew when one was going on because the fire hydrant was on, and the fire hydrant was your visual. Now, I am not suggesting that we open up all the fire hydrants, which I think the kids would love. The adults would probably, you know, react poorly to that. But, you know, it didn't take much once you saw a fire hydrant, or once you know, there's certain things that you can do they're very bright and clear, that let the public know what's going on and create an atmosphere that's about community coming together. And when we minimize that and we instead sort of cheap out on the importance of visuals, we actually create a lot more work for ourselves because we've not taken advantage of a huge communication avenue.
Thank you all for that. And I just sort of, if I can, one quick plug from TA's side, and then we have a bunch of questions for the group. Is we actually just put out a report that I think probably landed sometime during this conversation, which is a set of recommendations from TA about how we can remove NYPD from many areas of traffic enforcement that lean on many of the things that you talked about, from design to automated enforcement to looking at other types of ambassadors who could do this work, especially those at DOT. So I'm really heartened by all the ideas and encourage people who are interested, you can come take a look at the report that we just put out. It should be on our website right now. So if I can sort of ask for maybe give each panelists the prerogative that these are general questions. If you have a point of view, I'm sure all of you do, please share it, but we do have a lot of questions. So I'll read it out, and if it resonates with you in your work, then please share some thoughts, and if not, we'll get you another one. One question here is, beyond temporary open streets, how can we encourage the mayor or any mayor to create year-round car-free or car-reduced streets, so that these are not just fads, but these are things that could be permanent? And they specifically had talked about things like 14th Street, the busway in New York City. So basically the question is about how we can build on this momentum and try to make it permanent.
Well, the city has to have the political will to do that. And, you know, we've seen over the last decade and more, New York City develop programs that have been successful in delivering changes to our streets. And so this is another, you know, programmatic element that should be considered. What I get kind of concerned about is the actual capacity in-house at DOT to manage the demand for what might result by announcing such a foray into open streets on a more permanent basis. You know, there's a number of proposals on how to deal with some of this capacity issue, and I think there has to be some level of structural change that occurs. I know that Open Plans has a proposal right now to think about public space management, and public space management would happen much more at a neighborhood or district level, insofar that there would be actual staff and resources that can be applied, and open streets could be just one of the many things that can occur at the neighborhood level that communities can organize around and request and get in the ground in a more permanent way. I think the combinations and the flexibility on how to do that can be endless on, you know, what communities want to see by better utilizing their street space. So I think it really does going to start with taking leadership to have the will to create a program and be able to distribute that or make that open and known to everybody in New York City. And then I think we'd have a great success moving forward.
I have 3 quick points to offer. Foremost, we have to ground open streets in a set of principles and objectives that are not merely based in an emergency, because once that emergency expires, then the rationale for open streets will expire as well. And we have to ask ourselves, what are we trying to achieve? This goes on to the second point. What exactly are the objectives and quality of life outcomes that we are trying to achieve, and how do we measure them? Because, you know, when the summer goes by and it's time to evaluate the success or lack thereof of an open streets program, we're going to have to produce data and qualitative results that support why we ought to extend this program and expand it. And thirdly, we have to engage the non-white portion of the city, of which I think is 60%. Like, if you're building a political base of power to support a program, it's going to be ineffective if only a small portion of the city experiences the benefit. So if you're looking to build a coalition that works, you have to really bring other elements on board that are outside of the traditional, the usual suspects of neighborhoods that see these programs succeed. So those 3 things would be, I think, quite essential to building a case for a continuing program, year after year.
Another question is, it says, I think Open Streets is a terrible name and doesn't convey what they're trying to achieve. Do you think that there are better names for open streets that we should be using in our communities?
It's a tough one, but yeah, I mean, I think a lot of cities have adapted the concept or the general idea. And at this time, and this is to Shabaz's point, calling them safe or slow streets or healthy streets, that's really communicating about the distancing and the opportunity for mental health and physical activity that brings during the pandemic. So maybe pivoting that language a little bit, but there can be other more descriptive terms that get created, and there could be some variant on the theme in every single city to kind of figure out what's going to resonate. I don't think the name or terminology open streets, it's confusing people, because open to who, right? It's open to people on foot, but it's not open to people driving. That's very confusing. So it's certainly an established term that's being applied very broadly right now. So rethinking the name, I think, is a great prompt.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right, Michael. I think that we should, as an ex-photographer, we should be using photographs more to tell the story. A lot of people may not understand you know, what a slow street means. It might assume that you're driving slow down the street, but I think they will understand the image of a block party. They will understand the image of kids playing in the street. So we should make sure that we, you know, build a brand around this experience, and we use visual cues, we use sound cues, we use, you know, marketing. You know, again, this is not 101 in terms of marketing. You know, we're not going back to basics here. This is stuff that's well established. How do we use all of these cues to tell a story that's compelling, that really appeals and speaks the language of the target audience?
I agree, because I am not, like, my background was never in transportation and city planning. So a lot of the terms, my initial reaction is I don't understand them. And you know, when I first heard open streets, I was like confused, didn't quite know what it was. But I think part of it is just taking, like, and this would be idealistic because I'd be thinking of making things permanent, but it's about creating community space. So maybe the word street doesn't need to be in there at all. Like, how do we create more space for our communities? And that, I think, helps people understand that when you say street, you think about car and you think about things going wrong. And when you say community space, you think about having more places to express yourself, to let your kids run around, for old people to sit on a bench and talk to somebody else. And so maybe it's just, you know, as simple as starting to move away from the word street every time we talk about it.
There's a question here from somebody, I think they're in New Haven, but they said, what are your thoughts on an if you build it, they will come strategy to open or complete streets? I've approached city leaders here and keep getting pushback along the lines of there aren't enough bikers to justify building the infrastructure, or we don't have the density that would make this successful. So do you have any suggestions about communities that may not have them yet that want to try to advance this work?
Is the question, I mean, you mentioned cyclists. Are we talking about open streets? Are we talking about like more general bike infrastructure?
The question said, I think they were trying to get a strategy for open or complete streets. So I think you can answer either one of those, whatever your expertise is.
Okay. You know, I'm just grappling with the delta between a complete street and an open street. I think they're different programs. For open streets, I really do think, you know, induced demand is probably a model that doesn't work. You need to really engage with the community to help the community understand what a street closure looks like. What is the realm of possibility? Just because you close a street down doesn't mean people are going to use it. When, you know, I think mentally we are accustomed to a space of streets are for vehicles and something may be happening in the street. As far as a complete street where you have bike lanes and you have, you know, bike infrastructure, or you've got pedestrian infrastructure enhancements, I think the induced demand model is probably more appropriate there. However, you know, we return to the same challenge, which is just because you build something doesn't mean, you know, that something is providing value. So if we're going to build a bicycle lane, is it wide enough? Is it protected? Is it part of a larger network? What is the quality of the thing that we're building? And if it's built well, just like public transit infrastructure that's built well, we can expect a culture shift to follow. Maybe not immediately, but to follow eventually.
Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, the quick urbanist quip on that is typically, you know, if we measured how many people were crossing a river before we built a bridge, you'd never build a bridge. So I think the infrastructure does induce the demand, but I think Shahbaz's point is spot on about encouraging communities to understand what open streets are. So there's definitely some nuance between those two concepts.
Let me just close. We have a few more minutes, and I want all of you to have the last word, but I want to thank everybody for attending, and I want to thank Mira, Mike, and Shahbaz for your thought and insight. And I think the most important thing is that all of you are in the trenches doing this work every day, and just the insight that you bring from your work is incredibly powerful, and it helps to advance our thinking at TA and hopefully all of the people who've been listening. So I just want to close with each of you sharing a thought. There's obviously, you know, a lot of people who are thinking of this as a moment for true transformation in our cities, and I think we're seeing it in some places. I'm curious in each of your perspective, if you think this will be a moment that will potentially transform New York's future infrastructure, if it'll be minor changes, if you think this will be something much more significant. I'm curious how you think this moment through the lens of where we live. And happy to start with Shahbaz and then go to Mike and Mira, have you take us home.
Yeah, I'm grappling with that question a little bit. I think the answer is it can be, but I think it's the wrong foundation to start on if we assume it will be. We have to really be organized in both planning and articulating the kind of future that we want to get to. It's not something that we can take for granted. We have a moment where there are clearly a new need set. There's a new set of needs, I should say, that is urgent, and it's a inflection point for us to consider what is the purpose and utility of the urban streetscape. And if we choose to punt on that question, or we choose to embrace solutions that haven't worked in the past, we're going to get to a new normal that looks a lot like the old normal very quickly.
I don't have much to add to that. I mean, it's exactly right. Particularly here in New York City, without the leadership and the articulation of the quality of life gains that we know we can get to, and actually relatively quickly, if we have the leadership, we're not going to get there. And I think this is going to be very uneven in terms of the impact, both on transportation and public space around the country and the globe, but very uneven on other, related issues like housing, like public health, like access to services. These kinds of things are going to play out very differently depending on, right down to your zip code. So we have to be very mindful of that, and hopefully we can find leadership at all levels as we continue to advocate to build that vision collectively.
I think if people really like something, then it's really hard to take it away from them, right? So if people get used to a service, whether it comes here legitimately or illegitimately, and then you want to try to rein it in or take it back, you'll get a lot of pushback. So, the points that have already been made, to the extent we can do this the right way, we can make the space, the public space that we're making available actually accessible, and accessible to people who have otherwise not had it so they can enjoy it. Then hopefully that momentum will make it really hard to reverse. But you have to have that buildup and the right buildup in order for that to happen, because the politics is going to be tied to, how loud people are and how important something is to their life. And if that happens, then the politics will have to follow.
Great. Well, I think, from all of you, that's a continued call to action for all of our work, and hopefully for people to stay connected to TA or whatever local advocacy organization is in your city. So thank you again for joining us. Thank you to all of our incredible panelists, and I wish you well. Please stay safe. Thank you.